Well, hello, everybody. We are on again today. I have two special guests with me. I have Scott Amyx. Am I pronouncing your name right, Scott?
Amyx.
Yeah, I've got Scott Amyx. Scott is a very successful, he's an entrepreneur, he's a venture capitalist, he's a public speaker, he's an author, he's definitely a jack of all trades. And I also have with me one of our DU ambassadors, Curtis Ramsey. And this is actually going to be a really fun discussion because we're going to talk about Bitcoin and we'll beep and click about all these sorts of things. But Scott actually has an interesting message, which is all about, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And Curtis is, we've kind of become friends a bit over the last couple of months. And Curtis is definitely a guy that is all about, getting out of comfort zones. We had a music conversation the other day and, I was a little surprised. I think Curtis was surprised that with my taste of music, I personally like, maybe quote unquote harder core music. Like, I'm a big Eminem fan. I'm a big Wu-Tang fan and all that. And it turns out, Curtis loves, redneck country music. So he's telling me about, all the music and the lyrical stuff he's listened to. And I'm just like, wow, I think you're a big Coldplay fan, you said, Curtis, or Dave Matthews Band?
Both. Don't say anything bad about him either.
Yeah, a guy loves Coldplay and Dave Matthews, and good for him. So we're gonna introduce, sorry for the aside, but Curtis, why don't I hand it to you real quick? Let you just kind of say hi, and maybe you'll start. This is everyone out there. Curtis is out of his element. It's his first time actually interviewing somebody live and on public. So let's go, Curtis. Let's see how it goes.
Great, and Scott, I'm glad you able to take your time out, today and stuff like that to educate people and tell them about yourself. So I had to do a quick rundown of figure out who you was, and so I watched your TED talk, and I was very inspired about it. Your story, of coming to America and things like that. And I before even learning your story, I have implemented about getting out your comfort zone and doing things to be successful. So I was like, oh yeah, I definitely like to talk and interview you. So I commend you on that. So I'd like to know about you. Can you tell us your backstory? What do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, Curtis, I am so thankful that you and Charles are facilitating this webinar. I'm very excited. And frankly, you're actually exercising what my book is about, which is doing something outside of your comfort zone. So congratulations on that. What I always start with is actually not my position, my title, my company, but I always start with my personal mission statement. And the reason that's important, it helps kind of center the bigger story. My mission in life is fairly straightforward, which is to bring about exponential technologies in the most responsible way to develop regions and nations. Matter of fact, this week I'm actually traveling to Saudi Arabia to unveil a blueprint for the renewable energy sector. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm super excited about this conversation. I think cryptocurrency is an exciting field, but there's a lot of myths and misconceptions as well as a lot of opinions. And I think it's important for us to tackle all of them as much as we can. And I think in my mind, there are some volatility, there are some inherent risk, but at the same time, it is very much here to stay and it is sustainable. And I'm gonna share with you a new project that I'm working on called the human currency. And it's about challenging the monetary money supply altogether.
Right, that's cool.
Wow, why don't you? That's amazing. You want to tell us about this? What do you mean by human currency? Like, is this like a better type of Bitcoin? Is this like a fork on Litecoin? I don't know. Maybe I get too into this stuff, but
So one of the things is I'm a big advocate when it comes to fourth industrial revolution, such as blockchain, fintech, AI, and so forth. But one thing that's been bothering me is as I go into South Korea, as I go into Saudi Arabia and Eastern Europe and South America and so forth, and I give this message about how do you really tangibly start to bring about change using leapfrog exponential technologies. One thing that's been really bothering me is that I cannot, with absolute confidence that it's going to be great news for everybody. It will, in fact, create new industries. It will, in fact, create many new jobs. Snap.com is a great example. Snapchat is a good example of that, where you have AR filters and selfie filters that didn't exist 10 years ago. The point is that there's going to be some portion of the population that may get left behind, and they're not going to be in a position to be retrained or want to be retrained or want to pursue a PhD in AI, as an example. So what do we do about those people? According to McKinsey, based on some of the national data, an average OECD nation has up to 50 to 60% of jobs that could be displaced by 2030 from AI and automation. And the less developed that nation is, it can go up to 90% displacement. It's pretty significant. And if you think that the 40% of the Americans that represent kind of that certain view of things, it has, believe it or not, it's actually not about politics as much as about economic disparity. It's an income inequality where the bicoastals have benefited tremendously, but the people in the middle have not. And there's been recent documentaries where they've actually toured these real towns, and these are becoming effectively ghost towns, and people have no job, no prospects. So what the human currency is trying to work on is this notion of, well, we can't infuse new fresh dollars into, let's say, Detroit, which is one of the worst cities in the US. But could we, in fact, create a whole new type of economy? There's a data set. Unfortunately, I can't share that presentation with you right now, but there's a data set, and it's been really well documented, that shows the various sectors like factories and service workers and so forth. The only sector that's showing a growth versus a decline is something under personal services. Personal services. So effectively, what we're talking about is something called human services. It's when you volunteer. It's when you participate in nonprofits. It's when you help out a friend. But frankly, we don't get paid for that. There isn't necessarily an economic model for it. And as automation starts to replace more and more of our functions, a good example of this is in San Francisco, there is a startup that's working on radiology. And the AI neural net system is able to scan through 2 to 3 days worth of x-rays and be able to identify with high precision in less than 45 seconds. So what happens to the radiologists? In Stanford, we've seen cases where even the most famous radiologists with PhDs and MDs actually miss out a particular skin cancer that the system actually identified. That's the kind of potential future that we're talking about. So rather than being susceptible to displacement for certain segments, we can actually create new economies around that. One of the ways that we can start to do that, and I invite everybody that's watching to come and participate, just ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And we're creating this kind of open, almost like an open source project where we're asking the question around, is it in fact feasible for us to have a self-created decentralized system on personal services? Can we do an ICO? And more importantly, once we fund that and sustain that, could we in fact take some of the proceeds and invest into startups of the future that will at some point displace some of you or people that are already displaced, and actually have a direct ownership into the companies that's going to effectively displace humans. And the reason for that is universal income and taxing robots have a tremendous amount of gaps, and is going to be an answer, but is not the holistic answer. And frankly, corporations in no way are they going to want to get taxed or want to give anything in back to the people. Their main objective is profit maximization and back to their shareholders. So this is a mechanism by which we use cryptocurrency and blockchain to be able to have a stake in the future companies that displace humans and allow for us to be able to actually capitalize on the growth of those companies indirectly. Another way we can actually help sustain that is using the advertising paradigm. Advertising, I think most of us would agree, is fairly broken. But what if we can actually channel that into something different? Friend Brian Wong, who endorsed my book, runs KIP as an example. He's very familiar with this notion of moments or micro moments. Even Google talks this terminology of micro moments. The point is, it's not just when you're hungry and you want to reach out for that chocolate bar, but what if you're kind? What if you're doing some sort of service to helping somebody, a senior citizen, a child, whatever it is, and for that, you get recognized. In addition to the currency exchange that occurs in the people-to-people service model, these brands can in fact actually endorse or also compensate them for specific sets of activities that they participate in. So maybe Nike says, we're going to give you 10 currency human currency points for you being so kind to your neighbor, or you deciding to take care of your neighbor's pets, or the fact that you helped out in a nonprofit or soup kitchen, as an example. So we're allowing for people to actually create vocations and a way for them to actually create monetary vocations and jobs around this notion of people-to-people human empathy services. Because fundamentally, AI and robotics, as good as they are in terms of narrow AI, and at some point that's going to mass into supersets where it's going to replace functions and at some point jobs, it cannot replace the notion of human empathy, because in order for you to have empathy, you have to be human. And that's something that is frankly not replaceable whatsoever.
Yes, and to say on that point, I remember reading an article about about jobs in India, the telemarketing, how those are getting diminished because of automation, and so now it's like the hiring is minimal, and so now people over there, they're looking for jobs and stuff like that. So automation is happening, and trying to find a solution to solve that problem is vital for the future.
Wow, Curtis, I can't imagine you even got that. I mean, Scott, first I just make a comment, you are really intelligent. You're talking, I can't speak for Curtis, but, I'm just a corn-fed Midwestern dirt farmer here. So, we're just trying to get by, and, I'm happy to find a coin that goes up in value. And, you're talking like AI and the human factor. And, honestly, the thing that's coming to my mind, do you guys ever see the movie WALL-E?
Yes, I have.
Basically, all I see when I hear you is I'm going to be that fat guy with the drink in my mouth, hovering around and getting fed by robots.
Absolutely not. Actually, that's completely the opposite. Let me give you something more concrete. So when I go to Saudi Arabia to speak this week, and I basically deconstruct the value chain of renewable energy from production capacity, distribution, storage, and use. What we're talking about, just like what Curtis said, is every phase of those value chain is susceptible to automation. So let's take an example of ports. China has a fully automated shipping ports where it is fenced off to people, and cranes and ships, all those things, these machinery are constantly working 24/7 without people, and they're loading and offloading. You take that even further downstream to Hyperloop, not for passengers, but we're talking about for containers. So movement of containers, once they're off the boats onto the actual...
and Scott, just to be clear, you mentioned Hyperloop. I don't know what that term is. Can you define Hyperloop?
Yeah, Hyperloop is essentially what Elon Musk has really kickstarted.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this notion of typically underground or above the ground with essentially a vacuum tube, and it's able to actually push people or containers in these capsules at very hyper speed without any type of friction points.
Okay, so this is like some sort of air current process, or
using magnetic force.
Oh, okay.
But instead of using it for passengers and a very expensive, costly Hyperloop technology, they've actually stripped it down. So we're working with a startup based in Poland that is actually specifically addressing a problem related to ports. In terms of a physical port has a finite geographic space, and the only way you can actually increase the productivity is velocity, meaning the movement of those containers, and moving it off to the train depots and the truck depots. This Hyperloop, or the Europe loop that I'm talking about specifically, moves that, allows for that velocity to occur without human intervention. Then once it goes on the trains and then the actual trucks, that's going to be all autonomous as well. So you can start to see, even in the renewable energy sector, that we're starting to introduce massive amount of innovation and automation. So it is good news in many ways, but it also has some externalities. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of addressing those externalities to this notion of human currency that's based on fundamental blockchain principles.
This is an interesting question, and I guess this becomes a whole different discussion. I guess we're going beyond blockchain and just talking about, people and stuff like that. And maybe I'll share an experience. I'd love to get your opinion on this, Scott, but I don't know if I'd ever met, well, you probably don't know, but I also, I really am a farmer. We had gotten involved through a friend about, almost 10 years ago. I got into the vertical farming business. And I'm sure, in terms of being in front of things, agriculture tech or ag tech or whatever is one of those things that, everyone's always trying to fix the food supply with a more sustainable manner. And on one hand, in our space, we've actually got, we had a demonstration facility in Dubai. We have a farm in Oman that's up and running and in grocery stores. And one of the things that we always run into is this question. People say, hey, why don't you use solar, number one? And then number two, why don't you use more robots? Because we actually utilize a lot of human labor to, plant lettuce and cut lettuce and stuff like that. And, it becomes an interesting discussion because, like, specifically in Japan, the Japanese government, after the nuclear disaster, really made a big investment into vertical farming and, better techniques. They have got robots and things like that. And what's interesting to me is, I always see these places, they literally look like semiconductor facilities. And I did a tour, I don't know if it was Panasonic or Sharp. They had this semiconductor facility that basically was growing vegetables, and that was great and stuff. And you had all these robot arms and everything moving around. But simply speaking, the economics just didn't make any sense. There still seems to be, at least to me, I guess the reason why I ask is, I often see people get locked into solving a problem using one technology, whether it's blockchain or maybe it's Hyperloop or maybe it's AI or whatever, but they get so sucked in that they forget to step back and look at the big picture and say, hey, ultimately it's about what's the most efficient, whether it's time, whether it's cost, whether it's human labor or emotional, whatever, to get things done. And I mean, again, I'm just asking a question for the sake of asking, but you seem to be a guy that dabbles in a bunch of things, has a lot of viewpoints, and we'd love to get your impression, on that. Are we force fitting, blockchain, or are we force fitting AI, to solve something that may not, I'm not saying doesn't need solving, but, are we too married to that particular technology?
So what I would say is that true exponential technology leaders will rarely say that we lead with technology. And I don't lead with technology. We lead first and foremost with the business objective or the government objective or the human objective. And it's not about the tool set. The tool or toolbox is exactly that. But you're trying to figure out what is the fundamental problem. But one of the things that my alma mater, University of Chicago, taught me is always ask the question why. Oh,
you're actually UFC?
And if somebody says that they know the why, you must question that why. So I think spending the time on the problem and really understanding it and questioning your own set of assumptions is very important. Only when you have that degree of clarity, then can you start to look at your toolbox. And oftentimes, the best solution isn't necessarily the most advanced technological solutions. Moreover, great solutions is a combination of human and machine innovation. So in the case of the farming, Japanese farmers take incredible high regard to farming. The sustainability of farming and the way that it's done, it has rituals and heritage and ancestry built into it. There's a tremendous amount of pride. So for example, the shape of cucumbers and some of these fruits are really important. And the shapes will determine the price, the elasticity, and the demand function of these vegetables, as an example. So it's important to allow for the systems to do what they do best, from efficiency, automation, and productivity, but allow for the human computation to sit on top of that so that you're working symbiotically. Because farming, as you know, is not just pure science, it's also an art, and it's also a love. And I think it is one of those vocations where it's a lifestyle where it draws us back to, frankly, where we originated from a human civilization. And it's very gratifying. And I think as much as we want to automate it, there are some things that it's difficult to automate, or should we automate? And I think this is where we need to start to bring in things like ethics and morals and values and localization as well.
Oh, wow. So you made a mention that you're a UFC grad. Were you there for undergraduate or graduate, or?
I was there for graduate work. I did my public policy and business degree.
Oh, okay.
And I could not stand public sector, so I decided to go into the private sector. But
wow.
Has always been for the public, and it is very much. I make it very as transparent as I can. That I am no longer working for myself, but I'm working for the good of human beings, and that is the reason why I travel so extensively. I'm going to be going to Costa Rica and other places where I care about those people as if they're my own family. And there's nothing worse than seeing those people's lives fluctuate. So for example, if you're reading much about Venezuela, they're flooding into Colombia and other parts because it's just dire, and it's the kind of magnitude or scale of Syrian refugees. The way we help and solve some of these tough immigration and issues is not putting up walls, but it's about sustainability. How do you help those people to grow from a human capital, allow for them to create new IP and to build new industries that employ their own people, where they're incented to stay and work and to have a life in their own country? Because frankly, as nationals, we want to stay in our own nation. We don't want to have to migrate to another country if we don't have to.
Cool. Wow. So getting back to, the blockchain and crypto and stuff like that, you obviously have some experience or a lot of experience in this. Let's learn more about how you got into this. And, you're looking at technology, it appears to me, from like multiple different angles. So, how did you get into, I guess, tell us about the first time you lost money in crypto. It seems like everyone's got a great story on that front, right?
Well, I have to say, it's interesting. I'm actually, in some ways, when it comes to personal investment, I'm somewhat risk averse. I once had my Series 7, 63, and 65. So I know the volatility, and I know my risk profile as well. So I've actually stayed away on the sideline for some time before investing into cryptocurrencies. But one of the things I want to make very clear is that the real big belief that I've always had is the fundamentals around the blockchain notions, not just for the currency aspect, but the real magnification around decentralization that has implications to everything from governance to the way we transact and, frankly, disintermediate third parties and corporations even. So I'm a big believer of it, and I think we're at a pivotal point, a reflection point, and for JP Morgan and these government entities to involve or intervene or provide opinions around it is an indication that it's getting to a size and needs to becoming noticeable. And I think one of the things that's very important for the viewers to understand is that the way to hedge against external forces such as government and regulators is to start to self-regulate. And that's really the right model, because when we decide that the best thing collectively as an ecosystem is to do the right thing for the investors and start to put in education, a lot of it's actually education as much as flaw. I know there was some news around Japanese exchange giving away Bitcoins for zero cost because of some security flaws or something to that extent. But the reality is there are some fundamental system issues, but there are also human issues. And a lot of the things that we're seeing and reading about is around the human issues because they're not aware and they're not taking precautions.
So that's an interesting one, I guess. A thought to look at, I guess. Lost my thought. You're saying it's all about decentralization. And I guess, I'm not saying I'm against or for decentralization, but like if you actually look at the practical implementations of a lot of these decentralized networks, there's nothing decentralized about many of these cryptocurrencies, right? Like let's even look at Bitcoin. The way Satoshi, whether he's a real person or not, envisioned it was this, perfect decentralized world of, where, nobody has control, and that's how consensus is handled. Now, the reality of what's going on with Bitcoin right now is consensus is a function of hashing power, and hashing power is a function of resources, who has control of the supply chain, and cheap electricity. So because of those two factors, literally you have four people that, if they collude together, can mount a 51% attack and quote unquote take over Bitcoin. Ethereum is another issue. Ethereum's even worse. There's two people that basically have control of the Ethereum network. So all this, and it's actually an interesting debate. I had a conversation with somebody who's more of a, who styles himself like, a Bitcoin old guard purist saying blah, 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 blah. And we had a conversation because we're taking a serious look at the Neo platform. And in the case of Neo, Neo is a decentralized platform, but the consensus algorithm in terms of how you play ball, it's kind of like the NFL, right? You have to have enough Neo to get a seat at the table, but just having enough Neo doesn't give you a seat at the table. They all have to vote you in, and hypothetically, they could vote you out. And I'm not saying that's better or worse, right? But, that's kind of your more traditional co-opetition, oligarchy model. But, they make a good point, the neo people. And, at first I was like, oh, I don't like this, right? This is all decentralized and, we're all about the people and power. But the neo guys were like, okay, yes, hypothetically, Bitcoin is about the people and the power. But what the reality of Bitcoin is power is not decentralized. The people that control Bitcoin are the ones that, control the supply chain and have electricity. And the classic example of what's going on there is this whole Bitcoin Cash thing, right? Where you had someone who controls the supply chain of the miners, has the backing of a major government, and has a ton of hashing power. And then they decided to say, screw it, we're going to fork it and try to do a hostile takeover. And, for all intents and purposes, Bitcoin Cash is doing pretty darn well. And I'm not, my crystal ball doesn't work, but I think there's a good possibility that, Bitcoin Cash could take over what Bitcoin is doing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on this, Scott? Because, there's hypothetical and then there's practical. And the practicality is, everyone uses whatever advantages they have to affect change.
So Charles, I think you make really valid points. And for the audience that is not familiar with my background, I actually come from the Internet of Things background. So we were talking about Internet of Things and the potential for Internet of Things for the last 3 to 4 years. And only now we're starting to see that. Silicon Valley, for example, one of the biggest topics these days is decentralized or edge analytics, where you got neural nets that's running on the edge devices. The point is that from a practicality, what we're seeing is the maturity of the ecosystem. We're not quite there yet. So therefore, we're still very much running in a centralized model with the oligopoly type of a situation from a power structure. But I'm telling you that the ubiquity of the Internet of Things, and not just M2M, machine to machine, but real computing power with microprocessors that can rival that of big time computers from a cloud perspective, running on the edge. So eventually your home, public spaces and buildings and cities and so forth will be flooded with intelligent systems that not only have microcontrollers, but embedded SoC chips that is running locally and analyzing locally. And it's going to have the horsepower to handle workloads. It's going to have bandwidth. It's going to have memory. It's going to have storage. And more importantly, because we're starting to get into things like IoT, IoTA, and Tango as an example, where it's facilitating costless, frictionless transactions, microtransactions, which means that now these devices don't work in isolation. They work in a context of a larger, broader wireless sensor network. One of the projects that we worked on with a open source project called ROS was trying to make it masterless into essentially a decentralized robotic system. And we wanted to be able to scan kind of the nearby area, identify all the IoT or edge devices, understand what kind of capabilities that they have. Once we have a job, we were able to then distribute that job, in this case, mining as an example, to these distributed edge devices once they're secure and permission within my little garden, as an example. It performs that computation task, and once it's done, it's released for other jobs. So it may be hard for us to really fathom at this point, but I can assure you that we're very much in transition to moving to edge. It is going to be somewhat for a weird period of time transitionary, where it is the world that you depict, but we are also taking one foot onto a fully decentralized, and the grid, super distributed, super decentralized, is going to be bigger than any farms that's mining those coins that are controlled by just a handful of people. The other thing that I want to just put into context here as well, because I'm a futurist, is that quantum computers are not 30 years away, but they're 10 years away. And we're talking about universal scalable blueprints that's already available, but that we're starting to go from 10 entangled qubits to reaching about 100 entangled qubits, which is going to be X factor more than all the computational powers that's available today. So what that means is, when you have the computational power, it's for specifically solving prime integer issues, and this is why it's so important for security in particular, but the computation, the cost of computation is going to significantly decline with quantum computers. Around electricity, one of the things, like I mentioned, that I'm doing in Saudi Arabia is, if we can in fact increase the capacity and do it in a way that uses exponential technologies to increase productivity squeeze down the marginal cost, at some point, that cost to generate that one additional kilowatts per hour of electricity is going to be almost nominal. You got almost cheap to free computing power that's available all around you, almost free electricity, not just from solar, not just from wind, but also kinetic, thermal, things that can just generate electricity by itself. So one of the things that I mentioned in other publications is this notion of physioelectric sensors that gets fitted into concrete substrates, civil infrastructure. Means that as cars and things travel on top of it, the movement creates electricity and it's self-sustaining. And these are wireless sensor networks that generate data and communicate with one another and do the diagnostics of what's happening with those infrastructures. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's important to have a horizon perspective that there is a point in time view, which is very limited, and the possibility and where it's going. Now, there is one thing that I would absolutely concur with you, which is human nature to hold on to power, influence, and wealth. And that is one of the biggest issues that I have. And how do we start to use blockchain, right? How do we start to use blockchain to take some of that grip away? Because as people amass assets and wealth and control and influence, we do not want to relinquish. They want to hold to a particular paradigm. And our job, my job, is to start to decentralize that.
Yeah, so basically, like, to quote Hobbes, the Leviathan, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and your opinion or your solution is by decentralizing, that's your method, you think, of overcoming, balances or aggregation of resources and power on that front.
Absolutely. I mean, let's take Uber as an example. I think it was the founder of one of those startups that you can actually rent a car for a few hours or more. She had pontificated about, I think 2 or 2.5 years ago, that we're going to be shifting from shared economy to a decentralized economy where we don't need an Uber. We don't need to capitalize multi-billion dollars into this entity, but rather we can actually help facilitate many-to-many without the need for this corporate intermediary that fundamentally is amassing wealth. Because when I travel the world, one of the things that's really hard for me to bring up to drivers is they talk about how it's providing incremental income or partial income while they're going to school or they're kind of somewhat underemployed. Is that do they recognize that their jobs are going to be gone in just a few years, not 10 years, but just a few years as Uber and Waymo and others start to have fleets of autonomous vehicles? Those drivers are not going to have that extra discretionary income from this source, right? So who is benefiting from this process? It's the institutions that's controlling it. The future is very much of getting rid of those institutions altogether and allowing for the masses to communicate directly with the masses in an efficient, intelligent, real-time fashion.
Mm. So your answer, I guess, and this I'm going to kind of link back, is you obviously, are a visionary. You're definitely like more of a big picture thinker. So you're saying, okay, I see this future, Uber is going to replace all these car drivers with autonomous vehicles. We're moving towards decentralization. These are all wonderful things. Automation's coming along the way. We've got all this distributed digital computing power or quantum computing power. And we've got a problem to solve with your humanity coin, or no, is it the humanity coin or the human coin?
Human currency.
Yeah, sorry, the human currency. That what you'll try to capture now, this excess, is it excess energy is the right term? I'm not sure what to use, to kind of keep that alive, because people will need to shift, because you're right, all the Uber drivers will need something else to do. Am I kind of following you appropriately, or?
I think somewhat. There's a YouTuber who's a truck driver, and he's got a pretty good following. One of the things that he commented, which was very poignant, is in the past, if you needed a job, truck driving was one of those kind of stable, reliable jobs you could depend on to earn 6 figures. As automation takes place and gets embedded into all forms of transportation, including large trucks and semis, is what's going to happen to those people? they used to be truck drivers, but they can't even get a job at McDonald's because the cashiers and the chefs are going to be all robotic arms. It's already being tested right now as we speak. They can make espressos, they can make cocktails, they can make hamburgers, they can make whatever you want. And chains are incented to automate because it lowers their cost of operation, the OPEX, and increases profit margin. So as the humans cascade down, it is very much far from WALL-E. WALL-E assumes that somehow humans somehow benefit from automation implicitly. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there's some part of the population that cannot be retrained or adaptable or agile enough to fit into a new society, and because they're going to be left behind. And for those people, we need to have a way to be able to address their needs. Otherwise, what you have is basically the Great Depression. It is the Arab uprising. It is the populism. It is the nationalism that is not just in the US, but it's actually all over the world. And as the income inequality worsens, people are going to get angry. That's going to lead to uprising. That's going to lead to conflict and instability.
So how does you've identified a major issue, and you're right. I mean, definitely if people don't have economic incentive and something to lose, bad things happen. How does the human currency or the human chain, or again, I apologize for butchering what you're doing, but how do you solve that problem? I mean, I'm all ears here, right? I'm sure Curtis is like, wow, this is amazing.
So Charles, well, first of all, just as a caveat, I don't have it all answered. I'm starting to assemble brain trust, people like yourselves who are in the industry, who are very knowledgeable and bring very specific views and experiences to help out in these committees, because we have questions around the economic model, the monetary policy, to liquidity and fiat currency that sits on top of the cryptocurrencies. There's lots of things, and we have not worked it out, and we need your help. That's number one. But fundamentally, in a kind of a short encapsulation of the quintessential feature set, is that it is a system for the benefit of the people that are potentially left behind, but it's for everybody. Let's just be clear. It is not a system for the poor. It is a system for humanity, because the investment bankers, the CFAs and the accountants who think that they're doing great will actually find themselves out the door because they're replaced by robotic process automation, or RPAs, and AI in just the next few years. So they will need this, whether they recognize it or not. But what we're talking about is this notion of creating an economy, putting economic value to empathy. The example that I give is, my mother is disabled, and it was a very difficult decision for me to relocate from Silicon Valley to New York a couple of years ago. It was only until my uncle stepped in and said, I'd love to take care of my sister, my mother in this case. But the problem is, he is on a finite Social Security income. He has a hard time just paying for his housing and meals and gas money. For him to actually travel and take care of my mom, he doesn't even have that extra few bucks to pay for gas. It wasn't until we secured a county fund for AIDS that can actually receive hourly compensation for helping people like my mom, who are senior citizens, who are disabled. Now he's able to take care of her. He was going to do it anyways, but he gets compensated, and he's got extra money to pay for gas and have a little bit left over to even help his other family members. That's the kind of example that I'm talking about, where it's people helping people that currently doesn't necessarily have a really market efficient pricing to it.
So let me throw this out to you, because you mentioned, you're trying to tokenize empathy. Curtis and myself and a few others on our team, we've actually decided to tokenize love. So we have a token that we're putting out there called the Love Coin. Initially, it started as just kind of like a little joke saying, hey, we could program something on the ERC20 blockchain literally within a couple hours. But we got to thinking, and we thought to ourselves, what is love really about? Love is about giving. So one of the things we're doing is, we're not charging for these coins. We're giving them away because, the base assumption here is, you can't buy love, right? Authentic love is only freely given. But more importantly, because we want to increase adoption, this quote unquote love token is more about, education, right? We want to give tokens to people for free, not so that they can hoard them, but, we want to build in incentives where that, you want to send love to somebody else, first, just to make them feel good, but also give someone a reason to receive the blockchain, use the token, and then, learn just basic nuts and bolts of, how do I get this stuff in my wallet? How do I send it to someone else? How do I calculate gas on the Ethereum network? The list goes on and on, right? Because the first step is education and understanding. So being that you are a humanist and, on my side, I guess I'm a blood-sucking capitalist. So, and I'll just own that, I'm all about profit and loss here. How would you approach something like that, right? Is that a good idea? Do you look at that and say, oh my gosh, this is just a marketing stunt? Do you look at this as, hey, maybe there actually is utility value to, promote something, and yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing that out to you. I didn't even plan this, but you kind of sparked my interest.
I think it's symbiotic because when we think about the human empathy model, there's concepts of love, coaching, mentoring, support, friendship, and so forth. And one of the things I do want to make it very clear is we don't want friendship and kindness to be where it's always compensation oriented. One of the things that I think is very important is as part of this human currency model, we have to be very explicit up front. Just like you would say, for my coaching, I charge $150 an hour. For my advisory services, I charge $500 an hour. People have to be very upfront that it's a contract, that when I provide these services, that there is a fee to it. So that's important. But there are going to be cases where you want to do it just because of altruistic reasons, volunteer, help out, love, absolutely. And I think it has to be very clear. Love is a subcomponent of what I'm talking about. And what we're talking about fundamentally is right now, from a human personal services or human services, the way the government describes it, the kind of entitlements model, is very inefficient. From the way that it gets procured, the way it works with contractors, the way it gets the distribution of tax revenue goes to the people that need it, it is incredibly inefficient. And there are some things that, like I said, do not even have a market for. What we're talking about is, to your point, it actually helps encourage and meet an unmet markets, just like eBay did with collectibles and artwork that had a high risk premium because the spreads were so wide because of that market inefficiency. We're allowing for closer transactions and more efficient transactions. And what you get is people that are fundamentally feeling more supported, more loved, more, just feeling better about themselves. So let's take the example of Florida shooting. That is a huge crescendo in terms of a group of young people saying we need change around gun control, that the adults, whether it's Republicans, NRA, are too afraid to confront, right? That is a very worthy cause, but what they're doing has no economic value to it. What if we can start to put economic value to it, and people who are willing on the buy side can actually start to receive it, and there's an actual economy of transaction around it? That becomes efficient, meaning policy making, meaning the aggregation of people's preferences and so forth and votes become more efficient. And you apply that to nonprofit and philanthropy, which means you have navigators and other organizations that's always trying to figure out the KPIs and the merits of these nonprofits. You rely for the system and the people who essentially facilitate what is that they really want and value more so than other programs. You're providing the suppliers to then provide those needs. I think it's beautiful. I think what you're working on in terms of love is great. And I love the fact that you are entitling them, you are granting them. It is not something that they have to buy into. Same with the human currency. We don't want there to be any initial cost to them. They can buy more of it, but it's free. By definition, it's available to any human being that's alive. They should be able to entitled to a certain number of shares or coins.
Yeah, we actually, it's funny that you bring that up. It started as kind of just like a funny thing, but yeah, I mean, we're just giving it away. We're giving it away. We're not charging for it. We even have a disclaimer that you shouldn't buy love. Just come back to us and we'll give you more of it. So we're going to try to prevent speculation from occurring because we'll continue printing tokens as we feel it, and we'll just always print tokens. Interesting. So what we would do then is, what's the term, Curtis? It's like an atomic swap. So by the time, you get your empathy coin or your human currency coin going, we'll have more distribution of our love token. You're welcome to participate in our airdrop of our love token. And we'll do an atomic swap where, the love token can convert into the empathy coin, or, and maybe we'll fork it to tough love, right? So if, they need some empathy and need some tough love, they can get some of that. Maybe we'll have some real love out there too. Who knows? On that front.
I'm sure your viewers are just having a great time, because we covered a lot of different spectrums and use cases. But the point is that, coming back to what we're talking about, is that cryptocurrency is real. Whether JP Morgan or whether others, regulators, I'm from Korea, and Korea's definitely pretty hard on some of the transactions. The reality is here to stay, and from a long-term perspective, it is very much a viable rivalry or parallel system to the current fiat money system. And I think the key is those people that are in the ecosystem, it is our responsibility to do the rights. And to your point earlier, Charles, is we want to make sure that power doesn't reside with just a handful of people on a particular committee, particular consortium. We want it to be decentralized, and for the people to actually do this properly. More importantly, for the people that are watching, you got to treat this as an overall asset allocation. If you're thinking that it's a quick way to make a buck, pay for college education, buy that Ferrari, that's the wrong mindset. It fundamentally has to bring it back to CAPM model, capital markets model, with the asset allocation. This is just a slice of your asset allocation with a different risk profile, standard deviation, alphas, bars, and all that stuff, betas. So you got to figure out where that fits into your overall pie, and more importantly, tie to the appropriate goals and horizon. It is not meant for something that you want liquidity in the next 6 months. I think that would be foolish if you look at the last several months as an example, because you could have made a lot of money, you could have lost a lot of money. But rather, it's about having a horizon that's appropriate to the risk. So in this case, it's more like a mid, if not longer term type of investment. And when you take a long-term horizon, all of a sudden, the volatility that people talk about is less of a concern.
So we have a little fun, I guess, I don't know if it's an exercise or a brain tweet teaser that we like to ask. And it emanates from, are you familiar with the character called Goat? He's actually one of the big Bitcoin top 20. Have you heard of Goat before? It's a pseudonym for Chung Noi, but it stands for, greatest of all time. But recently there was someone that posted. So let me throw you this tongue twister. I would love to get your answer, or not tongue twister, this brain teaser, right? So a man buys a goat for $60. Then he sells it for $70. Then he buys it back for $80 and sells it again for $90. How much money did the person make?
It's a great question. I think it depends. Again, I don't want to give you an actual technical answer like cost basis, but
well, no, this is an open-ended question. Feel free to answer however you want. I find it more to be intriguing because it's a philosophical question, right?
It's not about cost basis. It's not about IRR. It's not about NPV, but it's about what are you getting out of it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, these transactions have to tie to a particular goal. So whether you choose to quantify that return, that's up to you, and how you do that from a formula or methodology, that's up to you. But you got to be very clear in terms of what you're trying to achieve from a goal. That's what I would say.
Oh, okay. That's a bit of a non-answer, but we'll let that one go. So, wow, we've been on for almost an hour, so it's probably going to get close time to wrap it up. But we always love getting people's opinions on crystal balls. And my crystal ball's broken, so that's why I like to ask other people on that. But, recently, since everyone's into crypto, the questions come up, right? Because John McAfee, who is a very colorful character, has made some pretty bold predictions, right? So we'd love to get your opinion, and Scott, what do you think? Do you think Mr. McAfee will have to eat his, what, or not? And before I start, are you familiar with what John McAfee stated?
Some of it, but I mean, I know he's quite a character, and he's quite bold, defiant, and vocal. And he doesn't mince words, but yes, he is very much a big advocate for cryptocurrency.
Yeah, so he basically said, Bitcoin at $1 million in 2020, or I'm going to eat it. So, what do you think? Is he going to eat it? Is he not?
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say is I'm not into speculation. But that's good for him. If in fact that's what he believes, that's great. But again, what I would say is, rather than making a joke out of it, is for the audience, because the level of sophistication on some of the viewers may vary, is you have to be careful. Don't let some of these quick money scheme type of a mindset to get a hold of you, because if you're investing in expectation of reaching that valuation, I think that's very scary. But if you have a specific goal that is longer time horizon that aligns with this, absolutely. The fundamentals, I think the fundamentals are in place.
Wow, that's pretty deep. Curtis, what do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. So you know, we bringing love to the table. We got empathy. A year from now, I want to have joy. You know,
All part of cryptocurrencies.
All I can say.
Absolutely.
Wow. So we're gonna get wrapped up, but Scott, I guess you want to take a second, tell people, but I guess you have a book now also, or you've got a, I guess Curtis had said he found a TED Talk about you. How do people learn more about you?
Just go to my website, scottamyx.com. It's AMYX. My book is coming out in first week of April. It's been endorsed by Tony Robbins, Singularity University, Tribeca Film Festival, as well as Forbes. And it's really a very simple message, but a powerful message, which is that the notion of success that we have is actually wrong. And that the real way to get ahead isn't luck or even 10,000 hours, but taking a step in the form of courage and risk. And cryptocurrency, in my mind, has all those elements. So as long as you're doing it for the right purpose and understand the risk involved, you are very much going outside of your comfort zone. So I encourage all of you who are watching to do something that's worthy and make sure that you're doing it for the right purpose. For me, it's not about becoming rich. It's about, honestly, it's about helping people and to making sure that we can address this income inequality that is plaguing many, many countries.
Wow. Well, I'm inspired. I mean, that was great. I don't know what you think, Curtis, but wow. Thanks for coming on, Scott. Really appreciate you. We'll probably definitely have you on maybe sometime again in the future. We'd love to get an update on, where your book is, where the emotion coin or the tokenized, human economy you're talking about. We'll make sure someone sends you some details. We'll send you some love so you can spread that around. And, great talking to you. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Curtis. Appreciate it.
All righty. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.